Hello everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Today's story, Fir Tree Trailer. Hello there. Do you remember E.A. Wade? He was a man with an idea, and he put his idea into effect and had lots of fun with it back in the 1920s, and incidentally brought a lot of attention to Grays Harbor in the Pacific Northwest. You know the old story about a better mousetrap? Well, Wade built a different home on wheels, and instead of waiting for the world to come to him, he went to it, and the world was mighty interested. You'll probably recall the story when we open the scrapbook to the page that tells of Wade's rolling home in a log that rolled across the nation and back again, and provided the folks in other parts of America the opportunity to see how big the trees of Washington looked. And the man who created the phenomenon had himself quite an adventure before it was all over. But first, let's take the customary few seconds that we allow Dick Crombie for our sponsors. And then we'll find the story of Mr. and Mrs. E.A. Wade and their hollow log that went to the city. It was back in the fall of 1926 that E.A. Wade began to put his big idea into effect. The idea wasn't really new up to a certain point, but at that point it took a twist that made it a pretty exciting to the fellow who looked like to travel and see the country. The idea had come to Wade once when he saw a picture of an automobile standing between the roots of a carved out California redwood tree. He saw that way back in the early 1920s and mused on it. And then, along a few years later, he gave it his own twist. Why not take one of Grays Harbor's big Douglas firs and hollow it out for a house? It would attract lots more attention than just a tunnel cut through the roots of a tree. After all, there were only two in the Wade family, Mr. and Mrs., and a home in a hollow log might be the right good way to beat the landlord and pick up a few dollars. Someone suggested, when he told them of his idea, that he might locate it along the highway somewhere and sell admission to see it, and sell postcards for pictures of it. And then he got the idea that gave it the twist. Why not put it on wheels and take it across the country? Already some folks were building houses on wheels, trailers they called them. They lived in them and towed them around behind their cars with stoves and beds in them. Why not put his hollow log on wheels and do the same thing? California in the winter and Washington in the summer? Now Wade hadn't lived on Grays Harbor very long. He was one of those drifters who had seen many parts of the country, and he knew that when the people of New York and Maryland and Texas saw a full-grown Washington Douglas fir tree, they would go bug-eyed for sheer wonder. That's why he had reacted when he came smack up against a 10-foot cedar one day in the woods. He could put the thing on wheels. Why not use it to promote the Northwest and give away some material advertising the big tree forest of the harbor and the Pacific Northwest? That sounded good too. He kept talking it over with his wife, and finally she advised him to get building the log house or stop talking about it, the way wives do sometimes. And that's why he got started. The Independence outfit was taking a lot of big stuff over the North River area, and Wade went out to the camp and looked over the big ones that were coming down. They had just felled a whopping fir 9 feet through at the butt end, and as clean as a hound's tooth. The bark was unbroken, and it was about as pretty a tree as Wade could have asked for. Of course, he couldn't use it all. In fact, he had been told by the state highway police that he could only use up to 8 feet on the highway. So he had to go up the tree one cut to get the section that suited his needs. And he had them cut out the section about 16 feet long and handled it with care so not to break the bark or damage it in any way. And he had it moved to one side where he could begin work on it. He hired a couple of flunkies to help him and began to work on that 8-foot log like a human termite. First, he bored a hole clear through the log, lengthwise. He had an extend the bit with a piece of iron pipe, and it took a couple of days to shove the auger through, but it finally came out the other end. And then he squirted oil into the hole and started a fire with a blow-end torch and kept it going with a good draft and burnt a hole until it was nearly 4 feet in diameter, right out of the center of the log. Then he got inside with his 2 helpers, and they began to chip away at the log like little beavers, making the chips fly until they had left about 10 inches of wood under the bark, and had a hole through the log that was more than 6 feet in diameter. That was the day that Wade named his project. He called it Columbus. You see, the first thing that he did, being a methodical man, was to count all the rings in the tree, and he figured backwards until he found out that the tree had started to grow in the woods of Grays Harbor in about 1490, which he figured was close enough to the date that the great Genoese navigator was getting ready to hoist hook on his 3 little ships to make a voyage to the New World. So he named the hollow log after Christopher Columbus, which was about as good an idea as any, as the old sailor ever had dedicated to him, considering the work that went into it. Well, with Columbus neatly hollowed out, Wade had it hoisted onto a trailer that he had made for it and bolted it down, and then Columbus came to town. The people of Aberdeen, Hoquiam, and Cosmopolis had seen a lot of Douglas firs, bigger than this one even, but this was the first one they'd ever seen that had a profile of a mailing tube. And they came to look and hear the story. Wade parked it near his home and went to work on furnishings. He built ends into the log, varnished the inside, cut a couple windows through the walls, and installed a door. Then he ran in electrical lights and moved the pair of folding beds, some cupboards, a breakfast set, and an oil stove, and it was livable. It was about this time that a representative from the West Coast Lumbermen's Association was in town and saw the strange trailer, and he carried the story back to Colonel Bill Greeley, the new director of the organization, who had just come west from his job as chief of the U.S. Forest Service, and he was looking for a way to impress the nation with our Northwest timber. Colonel Bill stroked his pointed chin and suggested that they subsidize Wade and equipped him with plenty of printed material of Northwest lumber and send him around to the big city markets where he could advertise Douglas fir lumber. So it was right after that Wade received his offer to do a turn through the nation with his log trailer selling the forest of the Pacific Northwest, and he accepted the offer. In the fall of 1926, Mr. and Mrs. E.A. Wade left the harbor with their Douglas fir tree house for a great adventure. They were harbor ambassadors of goodwill to all of America as they rolled along from state to state. Their route was south into Oregon, where the log house was novel, but everyone had seen plenty of big firs, and no one got very excited. California came next, and except that it was a Douglas fir, it was not a redwood. It wasn't anything to get steamed up about. But in Southern California, the crowds began to come to see the tree. In Los Angeles and in San Diego, the Wades parked their tree trailer along the curb and displayed it to the thousands of people. They had posted signs asking the public not to touch the log. They were afraid that anyone would want to take a piece of the bark for a souvenir, and had taken the precautions to protect their traveling home from destruction. But they didn't keep people from feeling it. and as thousands milled around the great log on the trailer, everyone had to touch it. Wade had cut a slice of the log from the top of the tree to show people how annual rings in the fir tree look and how you could tell how old a tree was. Then he gave the literature of the Northwest trees and forest, and the public took it. Radio stations broadcast descriptions of the rolling home in a hollow log, and the newspapers took pictures. On into Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas went the big log house. Then across the South through New Orleans and up the East Coast, with stops in Washington, Philadelphia, and New York City before they entered the New England states. In the big cities, the log was a traffic stopper, and police escorted the trailer and its prime mover into town with sirens wailing. The Wades got used to seeing farmers in the fields drop their hoses and pitchforks and run for the house to turn out the family for a look. In one town, youngsters seeing the sign, Douglas Fir, on the end of the log, spread the rumors that Douglas Fairbanks was touring the country in a hollow tree. Wade had explained that he was not the most popular movie star of the day. School authorities requested showing at the schools, and Wade's lecture on the trees of the Northwest while the children marched through, feeling and seeing the tree. In one place, 10,497 people went through the log trailer in a single day. It was wearying at times, the Wades admitted, but they had enough to entertain the crowd. They drove the big log into the tourist park somewhere and settled down for a few days of quiet and rest. For 2 years the tour went on, from New England back across the Lake States, down through Iowa and back over the Rockies and the Cascades. The big log rolled its Grays Harbor crew, and in October of 1928 it rolled back into Grays Harbor, where it had started its long trip to become the most traveled Douglas fir log in history. It had gone 24,000 miles through 36 states, telling the story of Washington's forest, and particularly the story of Grays Harbor, where it got started. And now, Dick Crombie, a few words from our sponsor. Well, that was the story of Grays Harbor's traveling log and the great idea of E.A. Wade that didn't stay a dream but went into effect. And when the log rolled back into Aberdeen, the sides of it, where people could touch it, were worn smooth with millions of hands that had reached out to feel the roughness of the Douglas fir bark, and to wonder if it was really a tree, or one of those newfangled sideshow freaks that was made up of old slabs of bark to look like a tree. But it sold America on the big trees of Washington, and told the story of Grays Harbor's forest to the entire nation. And as one of the manifestations of the gay 1920s, we find its story tonight in our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.